Okay, I think we can get started. Hopefully you've had the chance to answer some questions and to work through some things. Today we get to move on from the conflict with Saul's family, or at least that takes a back seat to what is happening to David. This first piece is interesting because if you remember, David was anointed king a long time ago already. This was years, maybe even decades before. He was a shepherd boy. He was taking care of his sheep for his father Jesse, and he was the last of the brothers. He was brother number 8. There were 7 others, and he was anointed king. But he doesn't rule yet. And this, I think, there's something at work in this that is really critical. You don't get to rule just because you have a title. You know, if you say that you're in charge and no one believes you, does your title do you much good? No. If you say that you're the king and you don't have a kingdom and you don't have people that follow your authority, you don't get very far. And this is something that I think a lot of leaders, a lot of people should take a bit more to heart, because the acclaim of the people, the choice of the people of David as their king is as important in many ways as his anointing by God. Because if they don't serve as his subjects, if he doesn't have a kingdom, then he's not much of a king. And this happens repeatedly in business, it happens repeatedly in life, where someone gets promoted and maybe they're acting like they have this new title. Well, if they've been a jerk their entire career, you're not very inclined to do what they say. And in work, it's a financial incentive. You know, that part is a little bit of the carrot and the stick. But it is really important. You can tell when someone who's leading something has the consent of those who are governed, has the people with them. When they're on board, you can move much faster and get things done. So David is finally acclaimed by the elders of the tribe of Judah as their king. Things are starting to take shape. He founds his capital in Hebron first, which is in the southern hill country of the land of Judah. If you remember, like, Galilee is in the north and the coastal plain is on the west, and then south of that, in most of what is the modern day West Bank, the West Bank of the Jordan River, is the Judean hill country. And Hebron would be in that area. It's south of Bethlehem. Today it's hotly contested because it's one of the ancestral homes of David. I think Hebron is where the tomb of Abraham was supposed to be. So Muslims and Jewish people today fight over Hebron a lot. And it is in the West Bank territory. And then south and west of this southern hill country is the giant desert that makes up much of the land, percentage-wise, territory-wise, of the country of Israel. So Hebron is a bit further south. And you have to ask at first, who does David rule? Because this isn't exactly clear. Like, he's in charge, but who is he in charge of? Because God anointed David as king of the whole people. That was done by Samuel when he was a boy, when he was a youth. But he doesn't rule over them all yet. In fact, the Bible tells us that this time period is for 7.5 years. It's quite extended. But he rules over the southern tribe, Judah, which was probably the largest in the area. There's a tribe that completely disappears from history. Anyone know which one that one is? The Amorites. No, the Amorites would be a foreign people, but that's a good guess. It's not one of the tribes. Nope, the Amalekites are another foreign people. This is one of the 12 tribes, 12 sons of Jacob. Benjamin was almost wiped out by a tribe, but remember, Saul is from Benjamin. And at least at this time, they're a little bit on the upsurge. Benjamin is being restored.
Gad?
No, not Gad either. The missing tribe is Simeon. If you look at a map of where the tribes inhabit or what territory they're given, Simeon is given the territory around Beersheba, which is in the southern part of Israel. You could still see it on the map today. It's still there. And that tribe basically goes poof. I asked one of the scripture teachers at the seminary what happened to them, and he said, "That's a good question. I've never really thought of it." Because they just sort of disappear from the narrative. If they intermarried with the tribe of Judah and just became absorbed, if they moved north, there's many different possibilities. But the tribe of Simeon seems to disappear. But David rules over the Judahites and also probably parts of the tribe of Levi. Some of the priests live or are part of David's kingdom. They're part of David's group. David continues to show his difference with Saul because it notes several times is seeking the Lord about different things. Should I do this? Should I do that? Saul doesn't seek the Lord, doesn't listen when God tells him what to do. David, on the other hand, at least at this point in his life, has his heart set on the Lord. He has a close relationship with the priest Abiathar. We encountered him before. And he's constantly seeking the Lord. He's not just in it for himself. He's not just doing his own will. It notes that David brings his wives and his men, and they settle there. He responds with favor to the men of Jabesh Gilead. These are the people that came and took Saul's body from the walls of Bethshan and buried it. That is one of the typical deeds of righteousness, one of these typical things that the Jewish people do. So that is a good deed. David offers them, I think he sends them some food, or he sends them some of the spoils, those kinds of things. And then it notes that there is a conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul. This conflict rages for some time. This is a civil war. This is a war between the tribes. The house of David is led by David. They have the king in the south. And the house of Saul is led by Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, and his general Abner. So Joab goes out to fight Abner. Joab is David's general, and he's a bit of a hothead. So they decide, kind of like the story of David and Goliath, that they're going to have this representative fight. So they choose 12 people from both armies, and the 12 people are going to fight, and whoever emerges victorious will win the victory. They will be declared the victors, they will be in charge. And what happens? They all kill each other. So there goes that plan. And then that is the impetus for a wider outbreak of fighting. And it notes that the house of Saul starts to diminish and starts to decrease. They're defeated by David's army and by Joab. Joab has two brothers, Asahel and Abishai. These names are going to come into the story later. You should always be suspicious when names are mentioned because lots of them come back. They are kind of hard to get a handle on, but I don't know, it's just biblical language. So Asahel chases Abner. Asahel is Joab's brother. He chases Abner. It notes that Asahel was really fast. He's like a gazelle, so he's running after him, and he's going to catch up to Abner. Now, Abner is a general, and he's kind of rough and tumble and a bit of a strong man. So he tries to dissuade Asahel from chasing him. He's running away. This guy is still coming. He doesn't listen. It doesn't work. Asahel decides that he is going to attack Abner. So Abner stops and it sounds like he sort of lets Asahel run into his spear, and he kills him. And then there's this line that Abner speaks to Joab about the spear devouring forever. I think this is something that we see very often. Wars tend to lead to more wars. And we could see this in the land of Israel right now. Like, the United States is pushing very much for peace and for the withdrawal of the Israelis from the Gaza Strip. And to Western audiences, that sounds good. Like, yes, we're going to end the fighting. But the problem is that the war hasn't changed the hearts of the people. And Hamas is famous for instance, teaching children as young as kindergartners. They chant death to the Israelis. They inculcate hatred in them of the Israelis as a people from just about the time that they come out of the womb. I don't know as much if it happens in Israel, although it wouldn't surprise me, because there's parts of Israel that have a very nationalistic bent, that have a very anti-Arab, Palestinian, certainly anti-Hamas bent. And some of it is because they've been fighting for years. But the real origin of the conflict lies in the hearts of the people. The real origin of the conflict lies in that kind of hatred, in that kind of distrust, in that kind of disunity. And so, will the war end Hamas? The answer is no. Everyone knew that from the very beginning. You can't wipe out an ideology, in this case, without killing all the people that are teaching it, or trying to make them go silent. But, they have so many reasons. There's so many historical roots of this conflict. And so what it does is, certainly it will set Hamas back for a time. Maybe it will finally convince the Gazans to take Hamas out of power. But you have to remember that Hamas has basically had a stranglehold over the Gaza Strip for a long time. They finally admitted that they were actually using hospitals to launch attacks, and they use ambulances to hide terrorists, so they drive them around in ambulances with lights flashing and then jump out as gunmen. Like, they actually had their spokesman admit all of that. It's not reported very widely in the Western media because Hamas and the Palestinians are very, very good at narrative. And that's not to say that the Israelis are completely in the right, but just like in this conflict, you see something where wars and fighting end up producing more wars and more fighting. It doesn't come to an end. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, retaliation just continues a cycle of violence. And this happens in other places too. One of the famous times in the history of England and France is the 100 Years' War. This war that's fought between two major houses or dynasties in England and in France, and it goes on, it rages for more or less 100 years. They're constantly at war over something. And this often happens to people. I think you can see this in couples that get divorced as well. That one fight turns into a second fight, and the cycle continues. And if no one breaks the cycle and admits fault and asks for forgiveness, then you say something that hurts one person, they say something that hurts you, and you get these layers of mess that are built on top of each other. And it happens in friendships, it happens with neighbors, it happens, there's so many conflicts where you can see this at work. And so I think that this is one of the things that John Paul II and the Catholic Church have really honed in on, that war doesn't usually solve problems. Sometimes it can, but it's very rare and it's very hard and it's very destructive. The people that are caught in wars the most are the poor and the disadvantaged. That's very true in Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Most of the Russian soldiers have not been from the elites or the people that are wealthy, the people that live around St. Petersburg and Moscow. Vladimir Putin has used it largely to wipe out ethnic populations of peoples he didn't like. So they've recruited a ton of Chechens. Chechnya is one of those areas that has a long simmering conflict and a lot of hatred in the hearts of the people. It's not an open conflict because of the brutality of the Russians and Ramzan Kadyrov, but it's still a mess. And so they've drafted a lot of those young men into the army and then send them to the front lines where they're most likely to be killed. So Abner notes this, and I think it's really fascinating coming from him, because he's a general that has been fighting David for years. He has been on this war path, and he's the one who says, "The spear devours forever." And again, later in David's reign, this is going to be one of the criticisms of God against him, that you shed too much blood, that there were too many wars. You can also see wars within families. One of them that's really, really tragic is how children will go to war over what happens after their parents die. And that is especially true when there is an inheritance, when there's money at stake. And I know of many cases where even good families that were raised well, that were perfectly peaceable while mom and dad were around, as soon as they're both dead, fangs come out and lawyers come out, and there's a lot of families where it's like they don't talk to each other after that. And it's all because someone got $10,000 more than the other, or someone got this and they didn't get that, and I didn't get what I wanted. It's really, really amazing. It's really, really amazing. And it comes out in all kinds of ways. The funeral director that I knew at one point talked about how difficult it was sometimes, because some families would come in after one of their parents died to plan a funeral, and they're all driving brand new Cadillacs and Lincolns. And then they're fighting about paying their bill at the funeral home. And I mean, when you see it, it's just like, it is really sad. It's not something good. I don't know if there's a good way to avoid it, other than I think you have to talk to your family members about what your choices are before you die, and you really want to make sure that you write it in blood and sign it in cement. Because, I mean, it is really, really amazing. I've had a funeral here where a daughter showed up and she had actually taken her father to court over their inheritance. And so she was filing a lawsuit against him while he was dying. And then shows up at the funeral pretending like everything is fine. Just sort of shows up and everything's good and she's all lovey-dovey. Meanwhile, they're going to be in court again in like a week. And she is suing all of her brothers and sisters because she was kind of written out of the will, didn't have time and patience for her parents while they were alive. It kind of moved away and left them to do their thing. And now all of a sudden when there's inheritance at stake, she cares a lot and she's upset. And I didn't get my fair share. And you made this will while you had dementia, and so it doesn't count. And, is that family relationship, is that family bond likely to survive that? I would doubt it. And this is way more common than I ever expected. I still feel naive because I don't suspect it constantly, and I'm very often proved wrong. Patience. This is another one. David has to wait for this kingship for a long time. I mean, imagine how this would kind of drive you crazy. It's like being told your relatives are coming in a decade. I mean, when God anointed him king, when Samuel anointed him king, I don't think he was imagining the length of time and the civil wars and the amount of fighting that would have to go on between that anointing and finally having the kingship. I just don't think he expected that at all. And he has probably seen the possibility. He's seen the moments. I mean, he's had temptations about this too. Saul is lying asleep at his feet, and he could easily attack him and kill him. He could easily, sort of advance the chessboard a few places, advance his marker on the chessboard a few places. But he doesn't. He remains committed to the Lord. He remains committed to following this way that he has laid out. And so David has to wait. I think this is a very difficult situation to be in. If it's ever happened to you where you're waiting a long time for things, you know that keeping faith, believing that God has a plan, none of that is very easy. I would suggest to you that the story of David is a great story to keep in mind if you face those times in your own life. If you face times where you feel impatient, where something that you think is coming is taking forever. Some of the Psalms that David writes that we have talked about, I think are beautiful things to reflect on, because patience is not an easy virtue to grow in. I think this is also part of David's growth and maturity, that David becomes the man that he is in the prime of his life because he has had to be patient so often, because through thick and through thin, through the darkness of caves and the darkness of faith, through Saul trying to kill him, and now at this moment when it looks like he's finally crowned king and things are finally moving in the right direction, a new civil war erupts. And the war was probably more dramatic and more involved than is recorded in the text of the Bible, because I think it only talks about this singular battle between Joab and Abner and their armies. And it seems like it must have been more than that. I think there's even some archaeological evidence of more of this fighting in different locations around Israel. So we move into chapter 3. The war continues between the house of Saul and the house of David. But Saul's house is decreasing while David's is increasing. Now that most literally probably references the sons of Saul being wiped out. He lost 3 of them in the battle at Mount Gilboa, like we heard in the last chapters when he died, Jonathan among them. So he has one natural son left and then one sort of strange relative, Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth. We'll deal with Ishbosheth first and then Mephibosheth later. But it notes that David has 6 sons during this time. And they're by 6 different women. And that's not really a good sign. This is something that ultimately will lead to conflict in the house of David. You could say this is the path of unnumbered tears. Because in many ways, all of these different sons end up causing headaches for him. One of his sons revolts against him directly, and the others are somewhat involved. One of his sons kills another one because he raped that guy's sister. Absalom is the one that leads a revolt against David, and David is really sad and has to flee Jerusalem. So it's kind of odd that biblically, literarily, this has the impact of the strengthening of David's position at this point in the story. Saul's sons are dying, David's sons are multiplying. But it's this kind of odd warning. It's this kind of odd bell that rings, and that's not going to bode well for the future. So, the next piece of the story is that Abner decides to come over to the side of David. What precipitates this is that his king in the house of Saul, Ishbosheth, which I think means like a foolish man or something like that. The foolish man accuses Abner of sleeping with his concubine, which may or may not have happened. I mean, there's a lot of sexual immorality in the story that is all over the place. That has been, sadly, part and parcel of the life of war for a long time, and when people don't get caught. But Ishbosheth accuses him of trying to usurp the throne, like Abner is trying to take one of Saul's wives or concubines to establish a new line, a new authority in the kingdom, to give him some claim to the throne so he can rule. So Ishbosheth accuses him of this. Abner swears an oath. He says, absolutely not. But then he notes that surely David has been anointed as king of all Israel. So it's like they all know that this is supposed to happen. In the background of the story is that even the house of Saul knows that Saul was removed from the kingship by God and replaced by David because he doesn't listen, because he didn't follow the commandments of the Lord. And so they all know, and it makes it sound like they're not just fighting against David, they're fighting against God. And fighting against God isn't going to go very well. So he decides to come to David. David tells him that in order for this to work, you need to bring me Saul's daughter, Michal. And she had been given to another man as his wife. So eventually the king, Ishbosheth, takes Michal from her husband that she had been given to by Saul and sends her back to David. Part of this is probably to do with rule and dynasty. Because again, it connects David to the family of Saul in a way. And this was a connection that the people probably knew about. Because Michal was living with David and one of his wives for some time, for a while, but then she's sort of taken back or kidnapped by her father or something. Or she despises David after he dances in front of the ark. And I mean, there's something that happened where she leaves David. Now David wants her back. And it might not be so much about her as being more about the claim to kingship. Again, if you look at the history of Western Europe and you trace some of the monarchical lines, some of the dynastic families, it's like this guy's king of Spain and he's also king of Sicily because he married this other person's daughter who inherited a title from her father. Like that's all over history. So much so that I think all of the major monarchies in Europe ended up related somehow. That they all were connected genetically. So Abner confers with the elders of Israel, so he starts going around the king. And this starts to show that Ishbosheth doesn't have very much power. He doesn't have the authority, he doesn't have the people behind him to stop Abner. Abner's the general, Saul died in disgrace, and so he is left with very little real authority and very little real power. Abner goes around him, he confers with the elders of Israel. He notes again that David was anointed king. He talks about going to David. They recommend it. He goes. he goes to make a covenant with David. Now, David does something odd here. Again, this shows the quality of the man. This is a man who has been fighting him and persecuting him for maybe something like a decade. And he throws the man a feast. I think in this we see something of the love of God, something of the forgiveness of God, that David, this is a really critical moment where David is demonstrating real compassion and real forgiveness in a way that's almost unwise. It's a liberality and a generosity that is maybe even too forward, maybe even too much. Because after all, this guy, he is certainly not above sneaking into David's palace while David is asleep and killing him with a spear. And then David would be dead and Ishbosheth would reign, which effectively means that Abner is king. I mean, he's not the most moral of men. He's not the most trusting, or he's not the most trustworthy of the men around David, because he was following orders from Saul at times when Saul's orders were clearly contrary to what God was asking. So David throws a feast for him, and this is the sign of a covenant. When you start eating together with people in the ancient world, it has that deeper meaning. It has that connection to making a covenant. I think this also shows David letting go of vengeance. David breaking the cycle of violence, that he wants to do something different. So he sends Abner away in peace. And it's at this point that Joab returns. And Joab is a man kind of like Abner, who is strong, who is a leader of the army, probably a long-time military soldier. And he returns from a military campaign. So he's probably been fighting Abner's forces, Saul's forces, in different areas. And he's suspicious. He seems to think, and the story seems to indicate, that David might not know the whole story of Abner, specifically how Abner killed Asahel, Joab's brother. That there is this conflict in the background. You have to remember, there's no telegraph wires, there's no instant communication. So after a battle happens, people might not find out what is really going on until much later, if they find out at all. So Joab seems to be bitter about the death of his brother, and he's extremely suspicious of Abner. So he cautions the king, Abner came to deceive you. Like, this is just a ploy. He wants to get on your good side. Is it true? I don't know. Joab certainly isn't above political machinations and political gains. We'll see that come out in the story over